Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I even love the smell of books. Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for readers without an off button. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
So Annie, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, memoir. Memoir is such a big thing these days, and I have a feeling actually during the pandemic a lot of memoirs got written. The one that I'll be talking to the author of shortly is a war memoir, a World War II memoir, and it's a little bit different to the average one. It's called Ghost Tattoo. Have a listen to this.
He had a tattoo on his arm with a number that he got tattooed from Auschwitz. And we just knew when he said, I don't want to talk about that, we just didn't talk about it.
That's Tony Bernard, who's written his father's story called Ghost Tattoo. His father obviously was in a concentration camp, but this memoir is about a lot more than that. It's about those chilling early days of World War II when the Nazis occupied Poland, and his father's great guilt about what happened in those times and how he slowly over his lifetime revealed the story to his son.
It's interesting. I will be talking a little later in the program to Dr. Kylie Cardell about the whole genre of memoir. And I think what's really interesting for me is just how varied memoir can be and how varied the process is of writing those memoirs. It got to the point where I was really sort of starting to wonder, what is memoir, what is biography, what is the difference? So it was great to have Kylie to join us to explain that.
I can't wait to hear, because apparently there's a difference between memoir and biography. Yeah. Fascinated to hear about that.
And Kylie actually calls it life writing. So here's Kylie on the topic.
The idea might be that memoir is about a moment or an event, and an autobiography is more comprehensive. So how do I remember my childhood? How has it shaped me into the person I am? How does my memory of that time live with me now, and why? Why do I remember this in this particular way? So memory is almost a key subject in the memoir.
And now to Tony Bernard's memoir, or his father's memoir, Ghost Tattoo. I spoke to Tony about how he grew up with his doctor father, who just gave little hints away, but took him a long time to really unravel and uncover the story of what was in his father's past.
We knew that he'd come from Poland and that he'd had a difficult time in the war. And, he had photos of his parents, just these black and white photographs, but we knew that they died. But he wouldn't tell us, he didn't tell us any of the details. He just said, I'd rather not talk about that. We knew that he'd been in a camp because he had one of those blue and white striped uniforms that he kept that in a drawer with a photograph of his mother, and that was a kind of a memorial drawer. And of course, he had a tattoo on his arm with a number that he got tattooed from Auschwitz, and he had a scar above the tattoo in his kind of elbow crease, a visible white scar. And he did tell us that the scar was from when he tried to kill himself during the war, but he wouldn't talk about the circumstances. But he did talk about the camps because, as it turned out, these were not the worst times of his war. He said that by the time he got to Auschwitz, he felt he was going to survive the war because of what had happened to him earlier.
When your father was in midlife, he got called back to Europe to be at a war crimes trial. That must have started to bring the history back to life for him. What are your memories of him going on that trip?
Well, I remember it well because it was a very big deal to fly to Europe back in 1970, I think it was. He was being flown back, all expenses, to be a witness at this war crimes trial. When we asked him about it, he just said he'd seen people being shot during the war and he was having to go and give evidence at this trial. So he didn't elaborate any more than that. It was a big deal, and we heard about this trial, and we knew other friends in Sydney who were from Tomashov, his hometown, and they'd also gone to give evidence at this trial. And it was about that time that we found out about us being Jewish, because he'd always hidden our Jewish religion as we were growing up. I had to sit in the playground and not go to any scripture at all. And I asked my father, what religion are we? And he'd say, well, you're no religion. You can decide when you're 18. But that's not really, kids just want to know what they are.
The part of your book which described the beginnings of the realisation that Jews were going to be targeted was, I thought, very chilling. Can you describe that sense that people living ordinary lives, wealthy people in a Polish town, starting to realise that there were some pretty nasty things on the horizon?
I mean, his town consisted of three basic populations in his town of 45,000. There were 15,000 Polish people of Jewish origin. There were 15,000 Poles of Catholic origin, and there were 15,000 Poles, and they were usually Lutheran in religion. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew who everyone was. But yeah, there was anti-Semitism. I mean, he describes, besides just anti-Semitism in his town, at universities, they brought in a quota against Jewish people for Jewish students. Initially, they limited the number, and then they banned Jews from going to university. And the Jews that were at university had to sit on one side of a bench. So this is in Poland before the Nazis took over. His parents didn't want to send him to university in Poland because they were worried about him getting bashed. People would talk to him because he didn't look Jewish, and the other thing was that a lot of Jewish people who'd come from the old Austrian Empire when Poland was reformed, they spoke Yiddish as their natural language, which is a German kind of Jewish language, and they spoke Polish as a second language. So when they spoke Polish, apparently, they spoke with a Yiddish accent, and a Polish speaker could immediately knew that these were Jews. But Henry's family spoke Polish at home. They didn't speak Yiddish, and he spoke perfect Polish, and they didn't look particularly. So people would often confide in him because they didn't realise he was Jewish. And on a train trip he had once, they had a discussion. This is probably 1938, and a Polish person confided to the group as they were discussing that he hated the Jews so much that if the war came, he'd grab a machine gun and kill as many Jews as he could. And that was a Pole saying that. The guy didn't realise that Henry was Jewish. So yeah, there was definitely anti-Semitism in Poland before the war.
Now, you did a series of trips with your dad through the 80s, 90s, and it was almost like the uncovering the layers of an onion. His story came through as you travelled with him.
We visited the concentration camps, and the Auschwitz in 1979 was in communist Poland. There was no Western tourists there. It was very run down. It had a few exhibits. You got a bit of an idea, but it was very slanted towards the atrocities against the Polish population because, of course, Auschwitz was a prison for Poles as well, for Polish non-Jewish people. So that was a lot of emphasis on the killing of Polish people, but less on the massive extermination of the Jewish population. We visited Treblinka, which is where his mother had died and where the Jews of Tomasha were all gassed and burnt.
How was he when he went to those places?
Because his mother, who he dearly loved, was killed in Treblinka, he considered Treblinka to be his mother's grave. And so it was always very moving for him. Now, Treblinka was completely bulldozed by the Nazis to kind of get rid of all the evidence. And so there's nothing left of the original death camp. They have reconstructed a memorial railway platform and a pathway through to where the gas chambers stand, and then they have all these stones, big kind of pieces of stone embedded in the ground, like thousands of them, each of varying sizes, each representing either a village or a town where Jewish people came from. And the biggest stones would have the name of a town carved out of the stone. And so, of course, the Tomaszów Mazowiecki stone, that's where he considered to be his mother grave. And he would scoop up some soil or take a flower that was growing next to the rock out, and quite improperly he'd bring it back to Australia as a memento of his mother. And he dried these flowers out and kept them as a kind of memorial to his mother. So yeah, it was very emotional, particularly Treblinka. And then he'd take us around his town and explain about the ghetto there, and a lot of without necessarily explaining his role. He never explained his role in the ghetto.
And yet that was very crucial, wasn't it, to the deeper, darker secrets he was not giving away.
That came out later in his life. But he had a absolutely photographic memory, and I can remember very clearly in 1979, alongside the building that had been the Jewish Council building and Jewish police station building, where there was a lot of people murdered there, by the Gestapo, pointing out divots out of the side of the building where that had been caused by bullets, and saying, well, this hole here was caused when they shot Mr. Alta, and this one was when they shot Mr. Ash. He could even remember the people who were shot who'd caused these divots in the building. He could remember it in that much detail. Well, this is where I stepped over the body of this person. This is where so-and-so was killed. This is where Dr. Hirschsprung was killed.
So it must have been an incredible experience for him to relive all that when he went back.
Yeah, well, he walked me around this area that's just a part of this Polish town now. There's no sign of a ghetto there, but this had been the ghetto during the war. You know, he showed me this is where the main gate to the ghetto was. This was where another gate was. This is where this happened. This is where you didn't have any of this technology to record this stuff then, but I didn't realise its significance, and so I didn't take it all in.
But you did eventually decide to tell your father's story, and you did film him talking about all of this back in Australia.
When he saw the movie Schindler's List, it had a huge impact on him. He said to me after, you know, the movie, he said, is exactly how it was. You know, and he went, did you see the bit where they tried to shoot the guy in the head, but the gun was jammed? That happened to me, he said. And then he'd said, you know, you see where everyone is swallowing all that jewellery? He said, I did the same thing. So he hadn't told me any of these stories. And he then opened up, Spielberg funded a filming of all these Holocaust survivors. And so Henry did participate in that and had a formal interview filming for the Shoah Foundation in which he told his story. And to be perfectly honest, I never watched those films. I mean, I think he filmed for about 7 or 8 hours on this thing, and I never watched it. But he'd always talk about things that he'd said in this to Spielberg. But finally, in 2006, he was 86 then or 85. He was pestering me to film him, and I'd say, well, you've already done a film for Spielberg. He went, no, they were asking me questions. This one I want to just sit down and tell the story from start to finish. So eventually I got I had a video camera, and I filmed him over 3 days, 3 hours, about 9 hours, and he told his story from start to finish with a few questions from me, and that's when I I started to fully understand what had happened. That was the basis for this book, because I told him, no one's going to sit down and watch 9 hours of film. It was only when I said, you've got to write this book. The only way it's going to be preserved is to be written as a book. So I started to do that, to transfer this videotape into a written form.
Why did you feel that the story needed to be told in this day and age? What is it about it that sets it apart after so many years and so many other accounts of the Holocaust?
Again, as he revealed more and more of the details of his Holocaust experience, we realised that how can I put it, the most concerning parts for him were the things that had happened in the Tomaszów ghetto. And we started writing this document I mentioned I was writing based on his videotapes. I played around with it for about 10 years, but as he was getting old, about 2016, I realised that he wouldn't be around for too much longer. I printed it out and had it bound and presented to him, and he read it all and he said, no, this is correct. So I took it to the Sydney Jewish Museum because they have a publishing service, and they read it, and the historian there said to me, listen, the stuff that your father's spoken about, no one's ever written about this before. Therefore it's got historical importance. There's going to be people who are very interested in this. You need to get evidence to back up this, what he's saying. And I went, well, like what evidence? How do you get it? He said, no, I'll help you get the evidence. There'll be documents to back this up. So then he arranged access, and he was particularly interested in the war crimes trial aspect. And he got access for us just as COVID was breaking January 2020. We flew to Germany. We got access for 3 days in Darmstadt to the war crimes trial records. Then I got an understanding of this war crimes trial that he was in, and in actual fact, the pivotal role that Henry played in that war crimes trial. He didn't understand the significance of his evidence, but he was one of the very few people to convict a Nazi murderer of his crimes, which was actually extremely hard thing to achieve in a West German court of the 1960s. They were incredibly difficult to convict on witness evidence, a Nazi murderer. There were 50 witnesses at that trial, and Henry's was the only evidence that in the end convicted anyone.
Do you think it settled your father about his life? Because obviously he had been troubled by these things he hadn't told you all those years, to see it finally in book form?
He was very pleased. One of the things that drove me was I began to realise that the existence of your parents, you take it for granted. I mean, he's just your father, he's here, and no matter, he tells you he has all these near-death experiences, you don't take it seriously because he survived them. And I started to realise how incredibly lucky he was to survive. I don't think people realise, with the Holocaust, I think everyone's become familiar with Auschwitz. It's become a symbol of, a memorial symbol of the Holocaust, because it was built in brick and concrete, and even though it was demolished, you could see the remains of these brick structures of the gas chambers and crematorium. And a million Jewish people were killed there, and over 100,000 other nationalities were killed in Auschwitz. But then 5 million Jews were killed at other places besides Auschwitz, and another 2.5 million were shot. I don't think people realise how many people were shot. And there was these shootings all over Eastern Europe and in the ghettos. And that's the kind of stuff my father saw and witnessed and was so traumatised by. Was these kind of up close and personal killings that went on.
So telling the story and bearing witness is incredibly important, I imagine, to anyone.
That's why he was pressuring me to videotape him. I didn't want to do it, but he really kept pressing, please, you know, he was 86 then, or 85 when he did it. He was obviously wanting to get it down while he was still alive as a record. And he said, I really want people to know what I saw and what happened. He names all the people as they get killed, and he's wanting to memorialise them. So people who hear his story will go, oh, that's what happened. If they happen to know these people or they're a distant relative or something, they go, oh, that's what happened to so-and-so. He remembers a lot of these people that are no longer, that didn't survive.
And what about for you? It's been a big chunk of your life doing all this.
It has. I had never imagined it would be taken up by a publisher. Like, I did this as a family project to record Henry's story, but Alan Unwin have looked at it and they think it has merit to be published in the wider community. And so it never started that way, but I'm very proud because people will understand when they read the book, they will understand the dilemma, the things that Henry had to face, the terrible positions he was put into, and the things he had to deal with in his conscience. And so I've done this as a tribute to my father, so people understand how, really how he suffered. He really did bury a lot of this, and it just surfaced in his old age. In the end, when I'd visit him he was in high care nearby, and all he talked about was the war again. It just all he talked about in the end. It just all kind of came to the surface. It was amazing. After living a kind of fairly, normal life, actually it was all there. It was just still suppressed,
And as you say, when he was, the only indications you had when you were a kid was that you had a father that occasionally got extremely angry, but other than that, nothing showed. And then as the years went by, it all kind of came out.
Everyone now knows PTSD. I mean, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, no one was talking about that. They used to talk of shell shock and things, but it was just not as well recognised a condition. I never understood his embarrassment or shame or regret about the ghetto police. It wasn't until I went to the Jewish Museum that the professor there went, that's why he said, no one in the Jewish police has ever written a book about it. And so this is why this is, really, and he said, and if your father had written back in the 60s this, he would have been abused by a lot of people because, some of the ghetto police had bad reputations. Until I wrote this book, I never really fully appreciated his difficult position that he was in and the fact that he felt so inadvertently complicit, in helping the Nazis. In the end, they were doing their bidding and helping the Nazis destroy their community.
Dr. Tony Bernard talking about his father's experiences that he has turned into a quite amazing memoir called Ghost Tattoo. What is it about memoir? Once you start getting absorbed in someone's story, it's really hard to look away, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think we all read to escape, but in memoir and biography, autobiography, we really are walking in the shoes of another person. And that's got to be making the world a better place if we've got that extra empathy that this type of writing can give us.
Also, the world is carrying on around that person's memoir too. I guess, I love fiction, but there's also something wonderful about going into a time that did exist with things that really happened around it.
Yeah, well, truth is often as strange as fiction. But funnily enough, we all enjoy reading this type of writing, but it's actually a topic that keeps academics up at night. They're in the business of defining these things, and it's not always clear what is the difference anyway between a memoir or a biography or an autobiography. So I spoke to Dr. Kylie Cardell. She's senior lecturer in English at Flinders University, and I started by asking her that very question.
A memoir, by definition, is a work of memory. So it's a text that works back to narrate and recapture an experience that happened in the past. And it comes from the French, memoirs, remembering. So memoir, though, is also a kind of form of autobiography, and autobiography is perhaps the bigger, more encompassing term, and we think of autobiography as the entire story of a person's life. But an autobiography can be a memoir, and some biographies can be autobiographical. So there's a lot of kind of blurring of the genre, and it does kind of keep scholars in jobs.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I think.
That's the idea. I guess then there's the next question of, if it's an event, what is that mechanic for delivering the piece of writing that you want to deliver? For example, a book that I've really enjoyed recently and spoken about on the podcast is Meshi, which looks at food, it looks at history, it looks at culture, looks at love, looks at loss. It reminded me of a couple of books I absolutely loved in the 90s, which were by Elizabeth Luard, which were Still Life and Family Life, about a woman who takes her children to Spain. And just, you learn about the culture and the food. Is that memoir? Is that...
Yeah, you really can use the terms interchangeably, I think. And in some senses, it's almost just an historical shift. So memoir is kind of the trendy term. But it does also let you know that it might not be as comprehensive. So I think Meshi is probably the author... I loved hearing that one on your podcast. It's on my Kindle right now. Is a story in which the author wants to look back over her life. And so it's probably more of an autobiography in that sense. But it's also memoir because she's trying to mostly work with her memories of that time. She's not necessarily going off to find documents and interviewing people. She's really working with, how do I remember my childhood? How has it shaped me into the person I am? How does my memory of that time live with me now, and why? Why do I remember this in this particular way? So memory is almost a key subject in the memoir, whereas an autobiography might try to tell you more about, I lived here, I went there, I grew up in this kind of time and place. But it's such a blurry line. And I think you can use them interchangeably if you like.
Yeah, and that's that truth debate as
There
well.
is a truth debate, absolutely.
Expand on that for me.
So I think this is really interesting. I was thinking about this in terms of why I like memoirs. And I like memoirs because they're about really interesting characters. But fiction's about really interesting characters, of course, as well. In memoir, there's a kind of a different claim. So the claim, whether or not it can be substantiated, is this is a sincere account to tell you truthfully about things that happened to me or somebody else in my life. And authors might use a variety of evidence to do that, or they might say, I'm basing this entirely on my memory, so you have to trust me that this is accurate. And this is a big kind of call because memory is pretty dodgy. I sometimes have trouble remembering what I had for breakfast. So there's also a sense in which memory does tend to maybe hinge on sometimes more difficult emotional times in our lives. We might have memories of really significant happy occasions, or we might have memories of really traumatic, deep things that are we're still processing.
And you touched on it earlier, the issue of curation and how we've become curators, what with the rise of social media and so forth. We've become the curators of our own story for others. Yeah. Do you teach that with your course?
Oh, yeah. So that, I think, is one of the most interesting developments in autobiography and memoir in the 21st century. Historically, You could write a novel and not be well known and the story would be taken on its own terms. But if you wrote a memoir, you kind of had to be somebody, you had to be significant. You had to have a public life for those memoirs to be seen as valid or reasonable. We've kind of gone to a bit of an extreme where some people might feel that everybody has a story, not everyone should tell it. But social media is one way in which we as ordinary people now have a chance to narrate or make a picture of our own life, have some agency over that. And it's not that this is you writing a memoir, because that's a very specific literary kind of creative and crafted thing to do, but you are telling a life narrative, or the platform is, and it's worthwhile having some kind of sense of how you look, what identity you present in that space.
So how did you get into this field?
Well, again, it's really interesting. So I did a whole degree in literature at the University of Queensland, and I never once studied a non-fiction text as a literary text. I used them as source material to understand more about the author's life. When I graduated, I was working in a bookshop and I got really, really fascinated with this section called memoir, biography. And I'm like, what is this amazing section of the bookshop I've never actually visited? I think that as a teenager particularly, I was very bored with reality. I really wanted to escape. And so it took me a little bit longer to sort of think, could there be interesting stories based on people who live now, not in the distant past or a distant galaxy or a different world? And I did find that in these stories were entrancing characters and worlds that I also did not understand in any way, that I live in my reality, but other people's realities is a whole different world. And so I went on to study diaries for my PhD and to think about the ways in which the diary has enabled women particularly to tell stories about their lives, because a lot of women historically didn't have a strong public role and didn't have the chance to be important in their own lifetime in a public sense, but they kept private diaries that show engagement with that world and culture and a lot of thinking about who they are and how they exist. And so posthumously these diaries are often published. As we've crept forward into the 21st century, internet media has meant that some people are now sharing their diaries almost live.
Is that blogging?
Yeah, so blogging was the big phenomenon in the early 2000s when I was first sort of starting this research, and I was quite taken by this. And so the premise is, here's my day-to-day updates of my life, and I'm going to tell you some of my personal thoughts, and it's I don't know where this is going, or there's no end yet because it's being written at the moment. It's very in the time. And this is one way in which the diary has become a really contemporary form.
So what are some of the other forms of memoir?
Okay, so I could talk you through some books I've brought in if you like.
Yes, please.
This biography is by Cassandra Pybus and it's about Truganini. So whereas we might think of biography as famous people, very important people, well-documented people who have public archives, and we want to know about the person behind the public kind of life, and that's what biographies often promise. In the case of Truganini, we have someone who's been very well documented by others, by people at the time, by anthropologists, by historians, but whose own voice has been lost to us in really important ways.
Documented largely by the victors.
Documented by people who, exterminated her people and drove them from their land and dispossessed and displayed Aboriginal culture for their own purposes. So, yeah, her voice was appropriated, or her experiences were appropriated.
But how do you get that back?
Well, it's a really good question. And whether or not biography can do that is a really challenging question. I think this is an example of a contemporary biography, shows us how some authors are seeing that biography shouldn't just be reserved for famous, well-documented people, but that by looking really closely at someone else's life and trying very hard to understand their experience and contextualise it, we might also then learn something very important, whether or not it fits to our beliefs about evidence or our beliefs about authority in relation to biography. What Cassandra Pybus does is she starts this biography with a personal story. Her family lives on Bruny Island. So her great-great-grandfather was a beneficiary of the colonial government at the time. And he's gifted these massive tracts of land. I think it's almost half of the island just given to him. What that transaction enables is the dispossession and exile of the native inhabitants of that land. So Cassandra Pybus feels deep shame about this. She knows she's benefited from this theft, that this is stolen land that she lives on and she continues to enjoy, and that she also feels emotionally attached to. It's a very powerful story. So she starts with this personal story, And then she also realises that one of the figures who crops up in family story is Truganini, who's well known in other contexts, but she hasn't really connected it to her family before. So as a historian, she goes off to find what she can find out about this woman. And all she finds is missionary journals and letters to governments and, people of the time talking, and sometimes she crops up in their narratives and sometimes she doesn't. So she uses all this historical documentation to immerse us in the world of Truganini and tell her story. So we travel with her as she's kind of driven off certain plots of land, incorporated into very toxic, violent missionary situations, as she struggles to live her life with her people in the ways that are meaningful to them and the ways they have cultivated for thousands and thousands of years. It's a kind of biography that requires you to trust, because this is not possible to have the evidence.
No.
But kind of living with her as she goes through these experiences is very, very powerful. And I do think it's actually particularly powerful for Australians to read about these kinds of women lost to history, particularly Indigenous women, whose stories can no longer be told by us, at least. So Cassandra Pybus tries to negotiate with
an
that.
informed imagination almost.
Yeah. It's very much informed. It's very researched. She's very careful to not speak for, but in some ways she kind of can't help it. So there's definitely a blurry kind of ethical boundary here. But I think she sincerely tries to ask us to imagine what it would have been like for this person living at this time, which is what good biography does for us in any mode. Knowing that it's biography then asks us to also go, wow, this actually really happened, and to take on the responsibility, the ethical, moral responsibility that asks us to bear.
Fabulous. And what else have you brought in to tell me about?
So another book that's also actually deals with race. This is Maxine Beneba Clark, who's a journalist and author, also a novelist, and she writes this memoir called The Hate Race. It's published in 2016, and it's a memoir of childhood. So it's that idea again of, I've got these memories of this time, this past time, and I'm going to revisit them. The memories that Maxine Beneba Clark is growing up in urban Sydney and then Melbourne during the 80s and 90s in Australia. It's a time very familiar to me. It's when I grew up in this country, in urban Brisbane though. And so what Maxine Beneba Clark experiences as the child of British migrants who are also West Indians is extreme racism. She experiences it as everyday, kind of casual as it can be, microaggressions and just kind of small things, and also very directly as kind of violent, horrific kind of ways in which she's prevented or degraded or humiliated. The memoir opens with her kind of in the present day, picking up her child from school, and she's walking along a road and pushing a pram with her 5-month-old baby, and someone drives past in a car and just abuses her and says, go back to where you came from. And so, this is a really horrific, violent experience for her. She's so vulnerable, just, the fact that the baby's there. So the way in which racism invades her everyday life and her way of living. And so she uses this memoir of childhood to then go back to, this is where I'm at now. I'm still troubled by this. This still affects me in my present day life. So what was it like to grow up with this? And she goes on to recount those experiences and witness to them, I guess, in ways that are asking readers of this memoir to also then question or reassess ways in which they might have behaved in the past, whether or not they're still living out those kinds of experiences or prejudices or biases that they haven't considered.
I know from personal experience, if, when I've dealt with friends or, family of mine who are from Asia, whenever they express a microaggression to me, I always express my disbelief, because I just find it hard to believe people are so horrible. But then I realise, after having done some reading of books like White Fragility and so forth, I realised that to express my disbelief in what they've told me is hurtful. I never understood that until this year. I'm 52 and I didn't realise. I thought that was showing empathy and, that to be incredulous was a good thing, and it's not. And so books like that can't be overstated, their importance.
I think they are. And it's that thing that memoir says, live a little through someone else's eyes for a while.
Yes.
And see what it is like to be this person. And I think this book was set on the national curriculum for high school students as well. So again, memoir has a role in this way, as all good storytelling does, in asking us to think hard about complex matters and engage with them on emotional, empathic levels.
So that was Dr. Kylie Cardell, Senior Lecturer in English at Flinders University, and I couldn't help but ask her. She teaches life writing, and I wanted to know whether she actually was ever tempted to write a memoir herself. But I have to tell you, I got a very hard no from her. She says she's a dedicated reader, an appreciator of others' work, but no desire to write one of her own.
I'm with her there, actually. I think I like dragging other people's secrets out of them rather than telling my own.
Yeah, fair enough. You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for people with creaking bookshelves.
Hi, I'm Patrick, and I'm in my late 60s. Reading in my life is relaxation. A combination of time filler, very relaxing, and you learn stuff. I just like that, the fact you can spend an hour or two in an afternoon and just lose that time. You feel better afterwards for doing it. And I remember watching both my parents doing exactly the same thing, and I guess that the apple doesn't fall far, you know. What are my favourite books? I've been thinking about this question, and I think the best way for me to answer is what books have I read more than once? That comes to the first. And which ones have I read more than twice? Obviously, I like it so much, and I've enjoyed it so much, I've gone back to it. The one I've read at least 3 or 4 times is the Story of Saint Michael by Axel Munt. But there are other books like The Fortunate Life by that Facey fellow that's set in Western Australia, and they're both autobiographical with bits of nice stories thrown in, tells you about the life they had at the time. I like just biographies too, and even slightly fictional biographies like The Any Human Heart by William Boyd, which is he just put his author's voice into this bloke who lived right through the 1900s and just gave a great honest depiction of a man growing up with all the vagaries of where you go in your life. It ties in the history of what was going on through the time. There's another book, the Map That Changed the World. That's that Simon Winchester who writes great sort of fact stuff, historical fact stuff, which I find good too. But there's a map in London. When I was in London, I went to that map to see where it was, and I like that. I do like the connection between the book and informing a travel destination, a part of a travel destination. My wife often doesn't know that's happening. I don't keep many books. I've decided to only keep books, mostly the ones that I've read more than once. So it wasn't very hard to just pick up half a dozen books that I've read more than once. So when it comes to Passions of the Mind, I haven't read that for 40 or 50 years. I read that when I was 17, 18, and then into my university years sort of thing. Tim Whitten's obviously the breath. I love breath. Something about breath, the way he tied the asphyxia thing in through life, all parts of life. I thought that was great. Near-death experiences, and then how it all came together. I thought it was great.
If you're keen to share your reading habits with us, your reading past, and give us a glimpse of what's occupying the space by your bed, we'd love to hear from you too. So send us a voice memo to sundokucast@gmail.com.
And I'm already looking forward to our next episode because, Annie, I believe you're going to share a chat that you had recently with Dr. Lisa Bennett about the Icelandic myths and the Viking mythology.
And about all the books that have come out of the Viking world over the years, and why we're so obsessed with Vikings, it seems to me, more and more these days than we ever have been.
Yeah.
Because, Vikings, they're brutal, honourable, all those things. It's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think we're just attracted to those larger-than-life stories of love and hate and rivalry and loyalty to clan. And
Absolutely.
That's it for Sundoku. I'm Michaela Andreev. Keep reading.
We'll catch you next time. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev.
Sarah Martin,
and me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free. And you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.